This is Gordon from Solar Eclipse Timer. In this video, I am going to tell the story of the controversial loud bang that occurred on Dive 80. We will listen to witness testimony about the bang and what OceanGate said caused it. We will learn about strain gauges and how they were used in the Titan. Then we will discuss whether or not the testimony from the engineers makes any sense. If you are one of the people that think the carbon fiber hull failed by being crushed by the pressure, and that Dive 80 is the smoking gun because of the loud bang heard and the strain gauge data changes, you need to watch this video. The story is not straightforward, and you might be surprised. Let's quickly discuss where Dive 80 lies in the history of Titan dives. The first season of Titanic dives with a new hull was in the summer of 2021, and the first numerical dive over the Titanic was Dive 61, which was aborted at a shallow depth due to mechanical problems. Dive 62 was also aborted due to issues at 1,700 meters. The OceanGate dive logs have Titan successfully making it to the Titanic for the first time on July 9th, 2021, which was dive number 63. There must have been quite a celebration on the ship that night. When counting dives of the 2021 and 2022 seasons, Dive 80 would be the 11th successful dive to the Titanic. If we want to count up how many times this hull was stressed to a deep pressure, up to and including Dive 80, we need to add an aborted dive in 2021 to 3,500 meters. And let's throw in the 4 test chamber dives completed in March of 2021 in the Deep Ocean Test Facility. These tests stressed the hull with simulated dives to 4,000, 4,200, and 2 dives to 3,840 meters. So now we understand the number of pressure cycles the Titan hull completed at Dive 80. It was the 16th time the hull had been stressed to a deep pressure of over 3,500 meters. Now compared to the version 1 hull, which had fibers popping like crazy, the version 2 hull was very quiet in terms of loud pops of carbon fibers breaking. For fun and some perspective, let's play some clips discussing the first hull. Here's Stockton Rush talking about it during a talk in 2022.
We made one hull. I took it to 4,000 meters, and it made a lot of noise, which is a very sphincter tightening experience. And it wasn't getting quieter on the second dive. It should have been dramatically quieter. If you think about it, when you get to this maximum pressures, you get a lot of popping and crackling. And the next time you go to that pressure, you should have a lot less. All those weak fibers and voids have all been taken care of. And this hull wasn't doing it. So we scrapped it. We went back. We built another one.
Here is Stanley, who was on the second manned dive with Stockton during version 1 Bahamas testing. He is talking about the noises in an interview just a couple of weeks after the tragedy.
He told us before the dive to expect loud noises that he had heard on his first dive. He described them as fireworks. I would say small caliber gunshots, same difference.
This is Mr. Stanley discussing it during the Coast Guard hearings.
You know, the sound of a carbon fiber band breaking when it's in a 5-inch thick matrix is a lot of energy being released. And we were all clearly a little disnerved, but he had warned us. But you could actually drive to deeper water by the cracking sounds would amplify when you got deeper, and which is even more concerning. There was a kind of like a grand finale of cracking sounds as we were getting close to the surface, which I'm not a carbon fiber expert, but just thinking about it logically, the only way that you get a whole lot of more cracking when you're coming back up is stored energy that was then released as the pressure was released.
Okay, the first hull was a nightmare. We all know that. We are going to circle back to something Mr. Stanley said, so keep watching. The second hull was nothing like this. It was behaving great in 2021 and 2022. It was really quiet. No fireworks or gunshots like we just heard was coming from the first hull. I'm sure that Stockton was thrilled with the new design. He must have thought the co-bonded technique was a real success. The second hull was quiet, and Renata Rojas was a mission specialist on a successful dive to the Titanic on Dive 81 in 2022. This was the dive after the loud bang was heard. Here's what she said about the hull.
Did any noises like that ever occur on the dives you were on?
No, the hull was extremely silent. And then throughout the dive, it's just silent.
So you never heard any noises while you were...
Not at all. You could hear a pin drop.
So again, if you are someone who thinks the hull was severely compromised during dive 80, note that the hull was really quiet and dove successfully after dive 80. More on that later. Now to the loud bang. Let's listen to 3 excerpts of testimony about hearing the loud bang. Here is Phil Brooks. Let's get his report first.
Were you aware of any acoustic anomalies that occurred either during any dive or upon surfacing?
The only thing that I remember when we had the loud bang that, we were pretty concerned about that, and that did produce AE activity. It was at the end of the dive after it had been on the surface for quite a while. It seemed like maybe 10 minutes or so, and that did produce quite a bit of AE activity.
Now, Phil Brooks said they were at the surface for about 10 minutes before the loud bang, and the acoustic data backs up that timeline. Look how the depth data shows them at 0 depth on the bottom timeline, but the acoustic event happens after they were at 0 depth for a while. Fred Hagen was a mission specialist in the sub at the time of the loud bang, and he describes the sound. Mr. Hagen's recollection of when it happened was probably incorrect. They were already at the surface.
Can you please describe what you heard?
Well, we were ascending. I don't recall the depth. I think we were fairly close to the surface, but we were still underwater, and there was just a large bang or cracking sound. And of course, sonic events in a submersible are alarming, so we were all concerned that maybe there was a crack in the hull.
Let's hear from OceanGate employee Antonella Wilby. She had degrees in computer science and was working on a PhD and had ROV experience. She was very concerned and talks about Stockton's response to a customer who heard the bang.
About what you know about that dive.
I wasn't aware until the next day that anything had really gone wrong. We were going through the debrief, and one of the customers stated that on ascent, but they heard a bang as loud as an explosion. I later spoke to some of the people who had been in the small boats helping with the launch and recovery, and one of them told me, I recall clearly, one of them told me they heard it from the surface. Stockton's response when the customer brought that up was to kind of, it seemed to me, immediately shut it down. I recall him saying, "We're not at the part of the debrief where we're discussing ascent and recovery, so we'll discuss it later." Later we got back to it, and he, again, just sort of, I felt brushed it aside. I just felt that didn't seem like the customer's concerns were taken particularly seriously in that meeting.
So that is testimony describing the bang. Note that it was heard by OceanGate staff working in dinghies on the ocean surface, so it had to be loud. What did OceanGate say caused the bang?
But it turned out upon inspection after we got on the ship that the fuselage of the Titan had just jumped in its carriage. So there was no damage.
I was told that there was likely a shifting of the pressure hull in its steel or metal cradle that when it popped back into place could have made that loud noise.
He said, well, it was probably just the sled banging against the frame. And then, deep sea vehicles just make lots of noise due to pressure changes.
So what would you think if you were scheduled to go on the dive after this bang? Renata Rojas was on the next dive, so she had to convince herself it was safe.
It was, in the debrief, was explained to us, with the change of pressure as you come up, the frame, the top frame that holds the sub, and the legs that could actually be dropped have a little gap. And as they came back to the surface, it skipped a little in the change of pressure. And that was the noise they heard. I actually at some point said, I want to go see it. I went down, and you could visibly see the difference between the top of that frame and the bottom of that frame. It didn't seem like there was any damage to the hull.
And what did the OceanGate oceanographer and chief scientist think?
What were your thoughts if you were diving in a subsequent dive? Did you have any concerns?
Yes, I was concerned and asked their chief engineer, Phil Brooks, if he was concerned. He said that this noise was a concern and that the OceanGate team was focused on trying to determine the source of the noise, and that would influence whether we made future dives.
Did they ever provide you any specific analysis of the real-time monitoring system?
No.
Okay, we heard stories from the mission specialists and the staff. Let's see what Stockton was actually thinking as per the testimony directly from Phil Brooks.
Stockton did make a comment about the cause of this loud bang, and he thought it was the frame adjusting to the sub. As the sub goes down, it compresses slightly in size, and as the sub compresses, the frame does not. Since the frame is hard bolted to the rings, as it comes back up, that the frame may have sprung slightly, and then it adjusted back to its original shape. And that was Stockton's theory of what that bang was the frame readjusting back to its original shape.
Did you agree with Mr. Rush's assessment that it was a frame shift that probably caused the loud bang?
Without being really a qualified mechanical engineer, his explanation sounded plausible.
After this meeting, I went to Phil Brooks, the director of engineering. There were the acoustic emission data that corresponded with the customer's report of this loud explosion sound. And he said, well, Stockton and I looked at the data, and we did see movement in the hole, in the strain gauge data.
If that dive 80 anomaly was a problem, was there any consideration of doing like an unmanned test dive after that event?
I don't think so.
And was the next dive with passengers? Do you remember?
It was.
So Stockton's explanation for the loud bang was the hull jumping in the frame, and you heard all the guests and some of the staff repeat that story. The troubling thing was Stockton and Phil had real concerns about the shift in the strain data, and they were not forthcoming with this information. The bang and the strain events coincided. Let's analyze strain on the sub.
When plotted together, one can see that the sudden change in strain gauge readout coincides with the large acoustic event.
Before we get into more testimony about Dive 80, this is a good time to discuss strain gauges, how they function, and how they were implemented in the Titan. This background information will help make sense of the remaining testimony. A strain gauge is a fascinating device. It's based on a fine continuous line of a conductor cut from foil. It works due to the fact that a metal conductor, when elongated under tension, changes the cross-sectional area to become less, which creates more resistance. This resistance is measured in ohms. The opposite is true. The conductor creates less resistance when it is shortened with compression because the cross-sectional area enlarges. When you bond the gauge to the surface of a structure for which you want to measure, changes in the length of the structure also change the length of the strain gauge. A single strain gauge has to be in the axis of the movement of the structure that you want to measure, and then there will be changes in its resistance, which would be measured in ohms. But the changes in the resistance of the gauge, either increasing or decreasing, are so minute you could not effectively plot the changes. So the trick is to use devices that put the strain gauge in a circuit called a Wheatstone bridge. This converts the changes in resistance seen by the strain gauge to readings in millivolts, and this voltage can be amplified to get a range of readings that can be plotted effectively. Let's watch a strain gauge in a lab setting. This is a strain gauge bonded to a piece of metal, and one end of the metal is clamped to a table. This is a wider view showing the strain gauge wired to a commercially available Wheatstone bridge, and also a display that can show the millivolt fluctuations in real time. When the metal is pushed downward, this elongates the strain gauge, decreasing the cross-sectional area of the conductor, increasing the resistance in the gauge, and in this demonstration, they are representing the deformation in negative millivolts. When the metal is pushed upward, this shortens the strain gauge, increases the cross-sectional area of the conductor, decreases the resistance in the gauge, and in this demonstration, they are representing the deformation in positive millivolts. The Deep Ocean Test Facility document has the exact model number of the strain gauge they used. Note that this gauge is smaller than your little finger's fingernail. They were glued to the inside surface of the hull and one set to the rear titanium ring. So all the plots you see represent movement of that inner surface. There were 8 sets of 2 gauges that were hooked up to hardware and software to collect data on a computer in the sub. 3 of the 16 gauges were not working. Note that there is some confusion about the group plot numbers versus the position in the hull. This is due to the fact that at the Deep Ocean Test Facility, the sub had 2 strain gauge groups on the front dome. These were moved to the hull for the actual Titanic dives, and the numbering for the positions was changed from what's on this document.
Where this can get a little bit confusing, there were some changes made to the strain layout. The AE gauges were the same, but the strain layout was changed because for DOTF we had strain gauges out on the viewport. Those were removed. After that we had all the strain and AE gauges together, and so the groupings may be a little bit different. I believe the placement is similar, but the numbering is different.
On the inside of the sub, this is how the installation looked. The sensors were fixed to the inside surface of the hull in the space under the insert, and the wires ran to the back of the sub. The strain data can start an interesting conversation about the engineering of the carbon fiber hull and the titanium rings. Group 1 is missing hoop data, and Group 2 is not working at all, so we can't use that data. Now, groups 3, 4, 5, 7, and 8 might be confusing because the green and purple plots flip, and the baseline millivolt reading starts at different levels. But the delta, the difference in millivolt changes between the surface and full depth, is the same at all positions. The radial delta is always about 700 millivolts, and the axial delta is always about 550 millivolts. That is fascinating because some sensors are closer to the rings and some are in the center of the hull, but the strain change was the same throughout the entire length of the hull. The Group 6 data looks completely different. The starting voltages for axial and longitudinal strain are very different for some reason, and for each, the change in voltage is only about 30 to 40 millivolts. These may be the strain gauges on the rear titanium ring. If OceanGate used the same settings for this group as it did for those on the hull, it would mean that the ring was much stiffer than the carbon fiber hull. If that were true, that could be a problem, but we just don't have enough information about this group to know why it looks so different. Hopefully we will learn more in the final NTSB report. The engineer who designed the strain gauge system for the Titan could make choices in the setup, like the amount of amplification of the voltage and the direction of the plots. None of that matters to us when we look at the plots. We know that they mounted strain gauges at 90 degrees to each other so they could measure in the direction of the hoop and the long axis of the hull. Let's look at a sample plot. The blue line tracks dive depth from shallow to deeper. The green plot is radial or hoop strain, and the purple plot is axial or longitudinal strain. Thinking back to the strain gauge we saw working in the lab, you see some choices that OceanGate made. First, they amplified the voltage to have a good range for the plots. Also, the starting point voltage is not zeroed out. The plots start in a positive millivolt range. This one in the 2000s, others at different levels. And the radial strain, which is green, starts at different points than the axial strain, which is purple. And they chose to plot all of the gauges in the positive direction. The reason I brought up plotting all gauges in the positive direction is because when I think about the inward deflection in the center of the hull and the fact that the gauges were mounted 90 degrees to each other, I would expect the axial gauge to be stretched and the radial gauge to be compressed. Therefore, thinking back to the strain gauge demonstration in the lab, an alternative way to plot the strain gauge data would be to distinguish between the two directions by plotting different polarities. OceanGate did not do this. They plotted both in the same direction, and that is fine as long as they understood their overall plan. For the Group 4 gauges, the change in voltage for the hoop strain gauge from the surface to Titanic depth was approximately 700 millivolts. The change in voltage for the longitudinal strain gauge was approximately 580 millivolts. So Mr. Brooks felt as long as the plot was smooth, he was not concerned.
So what I looked for in strain data was the linearity with depth, that if it went nonlinear with the depth profile, that was something to be concerned about.
So the jump in the strain on dive 80 did concern him, but we will see from Dr. Kramer's testimony later that this simplistic analysis of the data may have caused OceanGate to miss something important regarding the health of the hull. Unfortunately for Mr. Brooks, whose strength was not mechanical and materials engineering, OceanGate put him in a bad position when it came to strain analysis. Dr. Kramer came to the hearings to question Mr. Brooks, and then a couple of days later, Dr. Kramer would testify himself. Let's listen to that line of questioning.
You mentioned that after a dive, you were the first to look at the data. I didn't hear you say exactly what your responsibility was in the analysis of that data.
Really, my main task was to just get it out to everybody as soon as possible, make sure that the plots were done correctly and emailed out.
I know we've talked about your qualifications to evaluate that data. Did you have any concerns about the qualifications of OceanGate to evaluate the data?
Now, they were emailed to Bob, and I don't know if he showed them to anybody, but yes, that was a concern of mine. And
was there any discussion about reaching out to an external laboratory or contractor to maybe do a deeper dive on the stress strain and acoustic emission data?
No, there was not. Discussed it with Stockton, and he said, oh yeah, it's probably the frame.
When we look at this strain plot, what is missing? What is the main problem with using it to analyze what happened on dive 80, where strain group 4 shows this shift in the plot in both directions? Strain group 3 showed a shift in just the radial direction, and strain group 5 shows a shift in both directions, with the axial shift being a greater amount. Can you guess what it is? We have no baseline for what these voltages mean in terms of actual movement of the inner surface of the hull. For strain monitoring to be useful, the millivolts of change needs to be correlated with actual movement of the hull through testing. Data from the first hull was worthless. Data from the scale model testing was worthless because they both failed at around 2,800 meters. So the only data they had was deflection measurements they made at the deep ocean test facility dives. And amazingly, Mr. Brooks seemed to be unconcerned about that data because he failed to bring those numbers to provide them in his testimony.
And we had done slot to the actual physical distance. And I don't have that calculation with me, but we had gone through that process, to kind of validate what we were seeing. And so we needed to have an idea of knowing what we were seeing. I think the determination was for that dive 80 that was quite small. The level shift that we saw, or the amplitude shift, was a relatively small movement.
Do you know how a delamination or crack in the hull would show in strain gauge data?
I don't. Yeah, I don't have that XY comparison, whether it would show up as a shift.
I am surprised about this lack of emphasis on the physical movement, because this is crucial information to understand the dive 80 strain change. There is also no testimony about correcting the strain gauge sensitivity for the changes in hull temperature, so that is another variable that we do not have enough information about. However, I found a pearl in the testimony. In the multiple days of testimony about the Titan, there are about 3 sentences in Miss Wilby's testimony that finally gives us an idea of the amount of movement we are talking about. This is at a time when this information was still fresh in Mr. Brooks's memory. Listen to this.
So I did bring up delamination to Phil as could that have been, something indicated in these data? And he said, well, it was only a few microns. And so just the difference of a few microns, it seems somewhat meaningless to me without a further context of where it was. Just because that sounds like a small number doesn't mean that that's not cause for concern. it also appeared that, like, I certainly am not an expert, but it didn't appear that anyone else aboard had specific expertise in composite materials, nor did anyone employed at OceanGate at the time seem to have any of this expertise. And so
now we have an estimated reference point. Phil and Stockton thought this shift in the strain plots represented a few microns. At least for group 4, we can guess that an approximate 30 millivolt change at the ocean's surface represents a movement of just a few microns on the inside surface of the hull. This is a single data point, but at least it's something. We can say that we are dealing with movements that are microns, maybe millimeters, but I think it's safe to say that this does not represent a delamination that encompasses square meters of the surface area in the hull, although this small area released a lot of energy. Remember I told you we would circle back to what Carl Stanley said about his Bahamas dive and the hull storing energy from being deep and releasing it when it got more shallow?
Kind of like a grand finale of cracking sounds as we were getting close to the surface. More cracking when you're coming back up is stored energy that was then released as the pressure was released.
When they surfaced on dive 80, the group 4 strain gauge was deflected approximately 30 millivolts to the other side of baseline. This is stored energy. When it released, it caused a loud bang. Some said it sounded like a large crack or a small explosion. The folks in the dinghies on the ocean's surface heard it, so it must have been loud. And in group 4, the axial strain gauge released energy, but in an opposite polarity. That is interesting and confirms my point that I wish I knew how OceanGate set up the polarity for the strain gauges mounted 90 degrees to each other. And remember, 2 other strain gauges, 3 and 5, registered strain changes also. So even though this is interesting and gives us some basic idea of the degrees of movement at the strain gauges on the inside of the hull, if this represents a delamination, we don't know in what layer of the hull or how far away it is from the gauge groups. We are also at a disadvantage because the strain group locations by the number are not clear. And it was probably ill-advised to continue to dive, but they managed to survive 3 additional deep dives that season with no further bangs.
And I asked if they were going to continue diving the sub or if they were going to stop the operations until they figured out really what had happened. And he said, well, we'll do the next 2 dives on mission 5, and then when it gets back to Seattle, we'll do a visual inspection.
In addition, in dives 81, 82, 83, that we didn't see any more abnormal strain and AE data or any noises, any loud bangs. So that was the other reason for continuing ahead.
There is one final controversy to discuss about Dive 80, and this comes from the NTSB and Dr. Kramer's testimony. There is no question that Dr. Kramer doubted the ability of OceanGate to understand their own data and use it to monitor the safety of the sub. One of the things that Dr. Kramer realized is that OceanGate liked to look at its strain data plotted against the lapse time of the dive, so time was always on the horizontal axis, and data to be monitored was on one vertical axis, and the other vertical axis had depth. So they looked at strain events correlated with depth over the duration of the dive. And Phil Brooks only watched to see if the curves were smooth. And on the face of it, what they were doing made sense. But Dr. Kramer, being a materials science guy, saw the flaw. He realized the way OceanGate was plotting the data was making it difficult to see the real problem with Dive 80. The key was to plot strain data directly against depth. As he said in his testimony, it is more akin to a stress-strain plot, which is a standard way of visualizing this type of data.
OceanGate strain data was typically, and perhaps always, plotted as a function of time. The changes in mechanical response are easier to visualize by plotting the strain against dive depth, as shown here for the hoop strain at gauge group 4. Plotting the data in this manner is more akin to a stress-strain plot, which is a standard way of visualizing this type of data. Moving forward in time and looking at dive 81, the dive immediately after the event, we see a change in the initial strain response of the hull. The next slide focuses on the initial and final 1,000 meters of the dive.
Dr. Kramer's next slide is busy because it includes 5 dives. For clarity, I modified it with labels and removed the light blue plot for dive 81.
The graph on the left shows the hoop strain, and the graph on the right shows the longitudinal strain. Changes in the initial strain response are seen in both directions. Furthermore, the changes persist from dive 81 through dive 83, which is the last dive for which we have strain data.
When I saw Dr. Kramer's testimony with these plots for the first time, I thought it was genius and that it found the fatal flaw, because it made it clear that the hole was behaving differently after dive 80. But when I thought about it further, it occurred to me that this looks bad because he is zooming in on the first 1,000 meters of depth. Then I looked at other plots that were part of the NTSB report, but not in Dr. Kramer's presentation. I began to think that this may not be a big deal. Here are some plots from the NTSB report that add questions to the significance of this data. This plot of group 5 longitudinal strain is nonlinear between the surface and 800 meters, and then the strain corrects back to pre-dive 80 strain. So is the hole moving back into position? This plot of group 8 hoop strain starts off nonlinear, but corrects back to pre-dive 80 strain by 400 meters. This plot of group 3 longitudinal has dive 75 and dive 80, which are both pre-bang, not overlapping each other for ascent and descent. Look carefully behind the purple plot of dive 83. We would expect 75 and 80 to perfectly overlap. Then dive 83, which is post-bang, is plotting differently again. So this makes it difficult to analyze and trust OceanGate's strain data. Furthermore, when considering all these plots showing variations within the first 1,000 meters of a dive, remember, Brooks and Rush believed movement at the strain gauges on the inner surface of the hole was on the order of a few microns based on data they had from the Deep Ocean Test Facility. And finally, the hole did not implode during the next 3 deep dives and made no further loud sounds. So for all of you watching that think the loud bang at dive 80 is the smoking gun and caused the flaws that led to the implosion, what I would say is not so fast. It may represent hole damage, but not quite the fatal flaw. There are 2 significant things that happened after the 2022 season that may have something to do with the implosion in 2023 on dive 88. The fact that they left the Titan outside on the dock in Canada during winter temperatures that went below freezing. This is a huge problem if there was any unrecognized water intrusion into the carbon fiber. The second thing is the absolute trauma the sub was subjected to on dive 87 during the 2023 season, the dive before the fatal dive. That will be the subject of another video. If you enjoyed this video, please comment, like, and share it, which helps the algorithm offer it to others. And watch my other Titan analysis videos by clicking on the link to my playlist in this video and in the description. Thank you for your time.